Okay. So I'm not going to share much about myself. I know there was an introduction, but these are four logos that kind of represent the main things that I did in life. The first one is actually a youth movement. It's the Israeli Scouts, which I was really, really active in. I'm not going to go into each and every one of these. I'm just going to say that throughout my whole career, I never had to apply with a CV. And I think that's kind of what shows that I've managed to maintain a right network, not necessarily a strong one, but a good one for me. And hopefully I can teach you some of the very practical tools and tricks that I've used along the way. And I've also kind of told myself that I'm never gonna apply for a CV. I think it's hard for people our times to necessarily find themselves applying for specific jobs and boxes. Rather knowing the right person who will connect you to the right person, or become your co-founder or potential boss or employee or partner, is things that we can really use networking for as we grow. So this is kind of the way I see it, networking as a tool. I know some people say that they are not as good or don't like it. I really see it networking as a tool, as a business tool that, the same way I need to know a little bit of marketing and I need to know a little bit of finance these days. It doesn't really matter if I'm a freelancer or an employee or co-founder of a startup or human rights movements. We all have to be kind of these one-person businesses, right? We need to know some of all departments. So we need to know some finance and some marketing and some product, which is more about like, who am I? What is my product? What do I have to offer to the world? Which is a little bit, Anna, what you mentioned, kind of what do I have to offer into the conversation? What is the value that I can create? So networking is as well something that I see that if we want to run a good business of one, is something that we should be using. Some like it less, some like it more. Hopefully you like it more by the end of this. We're going to talk really briefly about what networking is, why it's important, where it's done, and then we're going to jump into the how, which is the more important and fun stuff. And we're, as I said, going to focus on an event, talk about what we do before the event, during the event, and then after. So, as we said, networking is a business tool, and it's really a two-way street. So when I say a two-way street, I mean, yes, it's important to genuinely get to know the person standing in front of you, but it's really important that both sides are in the situation. Networking could happen between two people, but of course it happens in small groups as well, right? And when you're in a small group, it's as important as it is in groups of two. But as soon as there's two people meeting, to me, it's networking. It's important to remember that it's not selling. And again, and I think that's something, a little bit of what you mentioned. To people, they know that I want to be asking for money. And that's definitely a challenging thing to do. And we need to know how we can stir the conversation away from that. Because the most important part when we meet people is to really genuinely be interested in them, get to know them, so that when one day, probably not in the first interaction, when an opportunity comes our way of creating some kind of a transaction, strengthening the relationship, whether it be, if people are going to give you money, investors or donors, or it's going to be someone I want to hire or a partner, eventually when that time comes, then the person on the other side remembers you well because you were genuinely interested and you got to know them. But it's really not about selling, definitely not on the first date, as I say, or when you really just first interact with someone. Networking is really hard to measure. That's why a lot of people say they don't like it, because it's a soft skill. It's hard to measure. Sometimes, if you're sent to go to an event or to a conference from your company, your boss would want to know if it was worth it. And it's very hard to prove because it's things that, we put in infrastructure for different relationships. But we only know if the efforts, it could be a week later, but it can also be a month or a year later when we kind of fetch the right people from within the network that we've built. And I really see it as mixing business with pleasure. Many times, networking events include, especially in London, I'm sure, alcohol and food. And normally it's kind of after work activities. It could be more formal, more casual. But if we manage to really enjoy it, we'll probably be much better at it. A lot of times I'm asked kind of, how can I seem genuine when I speak to a person? And I believe the only way to do that is really to be genuine and to genuinely be interested in the person you're speaking to. Otherwise, it's just probably not worth the time, and we can move on to the next person. But more than anything, and this is really something I want you guys to think of as we go along, it's really about value creation. And whenever I interact with anyone, and it really doesn't matter if it's someone at the store that I'm buying coffee from, or it's one of you guys, or it's someone I meet on the street, I always have in mind, how can I add value to this interaction, to this conversation? And it doesn't have to be in a condescending way. It could be a cool video that I saw. It could be sharing an article that I read that may be relevant to the situation that we're in. It could be an anecdote, it could be maybe throwing out numbers, I just met this person and I mentioned that we were talking about kind of, the different junctions within the career, the crossroads and kind of choosing your next step. And this person was really, wants to go into the tech world, but is very kind of scared because it seems like everyone is, writes code. Everyone's developers. So I mentioned actually 80% of people who work in tech are not developers, or they're not even technical people. So these little things that I throw in within the conversation is kind of numbers that person now has in their head and has learned. So definitely compliment, teach something new, make laugh. So if you're funny, making someone laugh is a lot. It's not to take for granted. People really like to laugh, and they remember people who made them laugh very positively.